In the years from the 1930s to the 1950s, in a small town named Willow Creek, nestled deep in the rural countryside of Georgia, USA, there were vast fields of corn and wheat stretching endlessly, along with sheep and cattle farms scattered along the dusty red roads. The town lay beside the Willow River, shrouded by oak groves and towering maple forests that blocked out the sunlight during the winter days. When night fell, the place grew even quieter and eerier. The people here mostly made their living through farming, livestock raising, and crop cultivation. Some wealthier families owned large farms with dozens of sheep, cattle, and even herds of horses. But the poorer folks had to resort to fishing by the river, setting traps for minks, squirrels, or water turtles, and sometimes ventured deep into the woods to gather firewood or hunt small game. In this village, there lived a farmer named Jacob Anderson. That night, after a heavy rainstorm that lasted from afternoon till evening, Jacob decided to go out and set a few turtle traps by the Willow River. He figured that after the rain, the turtles would leave their nests in search of food, making it a good opportunity to catch a few large ones. Jacob prepared an oil lantern, a small sack, and several metal traps that had been prepped in advance. He glanced inside the house, seeing Billy fast asleep, not wanting to wake the boy.
"Sleep tight, son. I'll take care of this. Tomorrow, you'll have a hearty breakfast with..."
He whispered softly, gently closing the door before leaving their small wooden house. Jacob walked along the winding dirt path that led to the riverbank. The pale full moon lit up the damp trail, and the gentle breeze made the old oak trees rustle softly. Occasionally, the distant hooting of owls echoed through the woods, as if forewarning of something. Along the sides of the road, moss-covered angel statues and abandoned houses created a hauntingly eerie scene. When he reached the riverbank, Jacob began setting each trap carefully. As he worked, he thought to himself,
"If I catch plenty tonight, maybe I can sell some in town for extra money to buy more food for the coming winter."
Just as he was fiddling with the third trap, he suddenly heard a faint giggle coming from across the river. Jacob looked up, squinting toward the far side of the river. In the pale moonlight, he glimpsed a small figure perched on the large trunk of an old oak tree. It was a child, or at least, it appeared to be a child. He couldn't recall ever seeing anyone out here before. The small figure sat huddled, knees drawn up, with long hair cascading down, obscuring his face.
"Hey,"
Jacob called out.
"What are you doing out here at this hour?"
But the child didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned its head, revealing a pale face and deep, hollow eyes like bottomless pits. Jacob shuddered, his hands trembling as the child's gaze locked onto him. That was not the look of a normal child. Not daring to approach, Jacob tried to maintain his composure and continued setting the last trap. But when he glanced up again, the child had vanished. Jacob breathed a sigh of relief, convincing himself it was just an illusion. Yet, as he turned away and took a few steps, a shrill, eerie laugh echoed from the riverbank.
"Daddy, come play with me."
The soft whisper floated right behind him. Jacob spun around, but no one was there. Gripping his oil lantern tightly, he hurried back home. But strangely, the further he went, the heavier his legs felt, as if something was pulling him back. Unable to bear it, Jacob dropped the sack and abandoned the traps, breaking into a frantic run. He ran and ran until he finally reached his front door. Only then did he dare to look back. And in the dim glow of the oil lantern, he saw the silhouette of that child standing in the middle of the road, silently watching him, its empty eyes staring, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. He stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would leap out of his chest. The next morning, when Jacob recounted his experience, no one in the village believed him. They said he was old and mistaken. Perhaps it was just a shadow or a small animal. But Jacob knew what he saw was real. He only hoped that child would not come back for him again. The villagers began to whisper among themselves that they, too, had seen the figure of that child, especially on rainy nights or nights with a full moon. Each time it appeared, it stood silently by the riverbank, its hollow eyes staring at anyone passing by, as if waiting for something. Its chilling laughter echoed across the fields, making even the bravest souls shiver. Strange things began happening to Jacob's family. He hadn't told his son, Billy, about that terrifying night, but ever since he returned home, he felt something wasn't right. Every night, as soon as he drifted off, a horrifying nightmare would take over. In his dream, he stood in the middle of a wheat field, surrounded by thick darkness. Before him, the child would appear again, with those empty eyes and that ghastly grin. It would stretch out its hand, its mouth repeating one phrase over and over.
Play with me, play with me.
The recurring nightmare drained Jacob of his strength. He woke up every morning drenched in sweat, exhausted, and growing thinner by the day. Billy noticed the changes in his father but didn't know what to do. Until one night, Billy had the same dream. He stood in the middle of a field, the sky pitch black, and the child with hollow eyes stared directly at him. The strange phenomena didn't stop there. Whenever Billy sat alone in the wooden house, he started to hear small footsteps, like those of a child running across the wooden floor. Sometimes, he would see his bedroom door creak open and then slam shut with no one standing there. Once, while he was reading in the kitchen, he felt as if someone was standing behind him. He turned around, but no one was there.
Is anyone there?
Billy whispered softly, but only silence responded. Gradually, Billy began to feel scared. He decided to tell his father. But as soon as he mentioned the child with the dark eyes and eerie smile, Jacob abruptly cut him off.
Don't ever speak of that again. Do you hear me?
His voice was stern, his face pale.
Don't ever mention it.
Billy was startled by his father's reaction. He said nothing more, but his fear only grew. He knew he wasn't the only one who had seen the child. He knew his father had seen it too. And maybe, just maybe, what was haunting them was not an ordinary spirit. One evening, as Jacob was preparing to sleep, he heard Billy scream loudly from his bedroom. He rushed in, finding the boy huddled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Billy pointed toward the bed.
Dad, look.
Jacob squinted, his gaze following. The dim light from the oil lantern fell on the mattress, and he felt his heart stop. On the old quilt, there were small footprints, wet footprints, as if someone had just stepped out of a puddle. Jacob swallowed hard, trying to stay calm.
It's just the rats, son.
Whispered, but at that moment, a soft giggle echoed through the room, clear and chilling. Both father and son stood frozen, staring toward the corner of the room. And then, in the darkness, a small figure appeared. The child stood there, its long hair draping over its face, only its hollow eyes staring straight at them. Billy screamed again, but this time, he didn't run. Instead, he seemed entranced, stepping slowly toward the child.
Billy, stop.
Jacob shouted, but Billy's legs wouldn't stop moving. When he was just a few steps away, the child slowly reached out, its mouth stretching into a horrifying smile. It whispered,
Play with me.
In a split second, Jacob lunged forward, pulling Billy away from the apparition and holding him tightly. But when he looked up, the child was gone. Only the wind howled outside the window, and a faint shadow lingered outside the house. After that night, Jacob decided he couldn't endure it any longer. He knew that if he did nothing, the sinister spirit would keep haunting their family. He sought out an old hunter in the village, named Earl Hawkins. Hawkins was an eccentric old man, living in seclusion on the edge of town, known for his stories of ghost hunting and demon banishing that no one believed. But Jacob was desperate. He had to do something before Billy was taken away forever. Earl agreed to help, but under one condition. Jacob and Billy had to accompany him to the Willow River on the next full moon, where the child often appeared.
I can't do anything without facing it directly,
Earl said, his eyes shining with determination.
I'll help you, but remember, don't let it touch you, not even once. If it does, no one can save you.
That night, they carried oil lanterns, brought salt, and a few herbs that Earl had prepared. They went to the Willow River, where darkness cloaked the water's surface, and the cold moonlight cast a ghostly glow over the still river. As the chirping of insects echoed around them, Earl sprinkled salt in a large circle, instructing Jacob and Billy to stand inside.
We only have one chance.
Earl whispered.
If we fail, never return here again.
The familiar laughter echoed again, louder and clearer than ever before. A small white figure appeared by the riverbank, its hollow black eyes boring into them.
Play with me.
The whisper reverberated through the air, as if coming from all directions at once. Earl raised his hand, throwing a handful of herbs toward the ghost. A greenish smoke rose up, causing the child to scream in agony.
Be gone, cursed spirit,
Earl shouted, but the ghost didn't disappear. It laughed shrilly, its voice piercing deep into the hearts of Jacob and Billy. The child's eerie laughter gradually faded, and the space around them sank into a deathly silence. Jacob clutched Billy tightly within the salt circle, sweat beading on his forehead. Outside the protective barrier, the ghost of the child still stood there, its hollow gaze fixed on them. Despite Earl's ritual, the ghost did not show any signs of pain or fear as expected. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger, the mist surrounding its body spreading, covering the entire riverbank.
Something's wrong,
Earl muttered, gripping the remaining bag of herbs tightly.
This is not a normal spirit.
Suddenly, the child took a step forward, slowly approaching the salt circle. It knelt down, reaching out a small hand to touch the white line of salt, then chuckled softly. To everyone's shock, the moment its tiny finger touched the salt, the protective barrier dissolved into a wisp of grey smoke, disappearing without a trace.
How is this possible?
Earl whispered, stepping back in disbelief.
So, it has no effect. This isn't a cursed spirit. This is something far worse.
The ghost slowly rose, its smile stretching grotesquely wide, reaching almost to its ears. Its voice, like a cold wind brushing against the spine of everyone present, rang out clearly.
You think you can banish me? This place is my home. I will never leave until I find someone to take my place.
Take your place?
Jacob stammered, his voice hoarse with fear.
What do you mean?
The child didn't answer. Instead, it lifted its hand and pointed directly at Billy. Its hollow eyes glowed with a sinister red light.
He will take my place. I want him. I will take him.
No, Billy is my son. You can't have him.
Jacob roared, pulling Billy back. But Billy, as if entranced by some unseen force, began to move forward, his gaze locked onto the ghostly figure. He stepped closer, one step at a time, as if drawn toward the child. Panic-stricken, Earl fumbled in his bag and pulled out a silver cross.
Stay away from the boy.
He shouted, thrusting the cross toward the ghost. But this time, the child didn't retreat. It just stood there, its gaze fixed on Billy, and then, its twisted mouth opened wide, emitting a bone-chilling screech.
Go away.
Earl yelled, his voice trembling. But in an instant, the ghost vanished only, to reappear right behind him, its eyes blazing red. Before Earl could react, the ghost lunged forward, one elongated hand wrapping around his neck, lifting him off the ground.
Earl!
Jacob shouted, rushing forward. But it was as if an invisible wall repelled him, throwing him backward onto the ground. Billy remained motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides, his eyes vacant as he stared blankly at the horrific scene before him. The ghost glared at Earl, its face contorted in rage.
You dare challenge me?
It whispered, its voice soft, yet filled with malevolence.
You think a cross can drive me away? I am not an ordinary ghost. I am bound by this river, by blood, and by an ancient curse. This boy will be the new sacrifice, and there is nothing you can do to stop it.
Earl struggled, but the ghost's grip was too strong. He felt his breath slipping away, the silver cross falling from his grasp. Just before he lost consciousness, the ghost released him, letting him fall to the ground with a thud. Jacob crawled over frantically, supporting Earl.
Are you okay?
But it was too late. Billy had already stepped out of the protective salt circle. The ghostly child now stood right before him, its blazing red eyes boring into Billy's soul. It reached out, gently brushing its hand through Billy's hair. And then, like a chilling breeze, Billy suddenly collapsed to the ground, unconscious.
No, Billy.
Jacob screamed, rushing to his son's side. He knelt beside him, shaking him desperately.
Wake up, Billy, please.
But Billy didn't move. He lay there, his face pale, as if drained of all life.
Your son will be the new sacrifice.
The ghost laughed maniacally.
He will be bound to the river, just as I was.
Jacob couldn't bear it any longer. He leapt to his feet, his eyes blazing with anger and despair.
No, I won't let you hurt my son.
Fueled by a surge of desperate strength, Jacob charged at the ghost. But the moment his hands touched it, a searing cold shock coursed through his entire body, flinging him back. The ghost only laughed, then slowly melted into the darkness.
Number.
Jacob roared, but it was too late. The ghost had vanished, taking Billy with it. The surroundings returned to the deathly silence. Jacob collapsed to his knees, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his only son had just been taken. Earl struggled to crawl over to him, his voice weak.
We can still save him, but I need to know what happened at this river before the curse began.
Jacob turned, his eyes filled with hatred and determination.
I won't lose my son. We'll find a way. Whatever it takes.
Earl nodded feebly, then collapsed onto the ground, utterly drained. Jacob struggled to his feet, his heart filled with despair and rage. Billy had been taken, his son soul-bound by something dark and malevolent. Refusing to let fear overtake him, Jacob was determined to save his child at any cost. He looked over at Earl, who was gasping for breath, his face pale from exhaustion. Despite knowing that this eccentric old man had little strength left, Earl was the only hope Jacob had right now.
Earl, what must I do to save Billy?
Jacob pleaded, his eyes locked onto the old man with a fragile glimmer of hope.
You know how, don't you? You know how to break the curse, right?
Earl slowly opened his eyes, his voice hoarse with fatigue.
I only know part of it. This curse, it wasn't created by an ordinary spirit. It's some kind of ancient magic bound to the Willow River centuries ago. It tied that child's soul to this land and forced it to find a new soul to replace it if it ever wants to be free.
Replace it.
Jacob whispered, his eyes widening.
Billy will become the sacrifice.
Yes,
Earl nodded weakly.
but there's something more I don't understand. Who is that child? Why was it cursed? We need to uncover the origin of the curse if we want to save your son.
Jacob slumped to the ground, his mind spinning with chaotic thoughts. He knew little about the history of Willow River or this town. His family had only moved here 15 years ago, and no one in the village had ever mentioned any strange happenings at the river. Maybe the oldest people in the town knew the truth.
We need to talk to those who know about this place's past.
He said firmly.
We have to find out who that child was and why it's trapped here.
Earl nodded slowly.
There is one person who might know. She's the last living member of a family that has been here for generations. She lives in seclusion on the western hill, near the maple forest. People call her Old Agatha.
Jacob frowned. He had heard of old Agatha before. She was a strange old woman, living alone in a decrepit wooden house, rarely interacting with anyone. Rumors whispered that she was a witch, that she knew secrets no one else did. If anyone understood the Willow River and the cursed spirits, it would be her.
Then we're going to see her.
Jacob decided, standing up with determination.
Right now.
Earl grimaced.
But dawn is approaching, and I don't have the strength to go right away.
Jacob paused, glancing at the old man who was struggling to catch his breath, realizing he couldn't force Earl to move immediately.
Rest for a bit. Once you've recovered, we'll go.
That morning, in Jacob's small wooden house, he didn't sleep at all. He sat beside Billy, who remained unconscious, staring blankly at his son's still form. The boy's face was pale and cold, like a block of ice, his eyes closed, and his lips dry and cracked. Every time Jacob gently touched him, the boy would shiver slightly, but he wouldn't wake up. It was as if a part of Billy's soul had been pulled away by the ghost, leaving his body empty and weak. Around midday, Earl finally stood up. He whispered,
I'm ready. Let's go find Old Agatha. We don't have much time.
Jacob nodded silently, gathering a few necessary items. He carefully wrapped Billy in a thick blanket and placed him gently in a small wagon. They would head straight for the western hill, where Agatha's house was hidden deep within the dense maple forest. The path up the hill was rough and muddy, dotted with large rocks and roots jutting out of the ground. The sky darkened, heavy clouds hanging low as if they would collapse onto the earth. The wind howled through the crimson maple leaves, creating eerie whispers. Agatha's house emerged in the distance, an old wooden cottage nestled among overgrown trees. The branches twisted around it, as if trying to swallow the house whole. As they approached, a black crow suddenly flew out from the window, cawing harshly, circling above them like a harbinger of bad news.
Is anyone here?
Jacob called out, stepping onto the creaking wooden steps. The front door was shut tight, the planks weathered and stripped of paint. There was no response. He knocked louder, the sound echoing throughout the quiet house. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A small, hunched old woman, draped in a tattered black cloak, appeared. Her hair, white as spider silk, hung down in thin strands. Her face was deeply wrinkled, etched with the lines of time. Her eyes, hidden beneath thick brows, gleamed with a sharp, icy gaze.
What brings you here?
She rasped, her voice like the croak of an ancient bird. Jacob swallowed hard, trying not to tremble.
My son was taken by the spirit of Willow River. Please, do you know anything about that curse?
Agatha didn't respond immediately. She stared at Billy, then turned her gaze to Earl, her eyes piercing through them. Finally, she curled her lips into a thin, almost mocking smile.
The curse of the river has been here far longer than you can imagine. You want to save this boy?
She asked, her voice dripping with disdain.
Do you know what price you'll have to pay?
Jacob nodded, his eyes never leaving the old woman's face.
I'll pay any price, just save my son.
Agatha nodded slightly, turning and stepping inside.
Then come in. I will tell you the truth about the curse of the Willow River and how to break it. But remember, not every soul can be saved. Sometimes, to save one, you must sacrifice another.
Jacob and Earl silently stepped into old Agatha's decrepit wooden house. The inside was shrouded in darkness, with only a few small candles flickering on iron stands, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of ives and a pungent, acrid smoke, making both men shudder slightly. Billy remained unconscious, nestled securely in Jacob's arms. He gently laid his son down on a tattered velvet-covered sofa and turned to old Agatha with a desperate look in his eyes. The old woman said nothing, moving slowly to a worn-out wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, its cover yellowed and cracked with age, etched with strange symbols Jacob had never seen before. She gently opened the book, turning its faded pages with bony fingers, her lips murmuring softly as she read the mysterious words.
The curse of the Willow River is not a simple matter.
Old Agatha began, her voice low and steady, like the wind whispering through the trees.
It dates back more than 2 centuries, to a time when this river was a sacred place revered by the native tribes. They believed that the river housed an ancient spirit guardian deity. But then, a great tragedy struck.
She paused, her eyes drifting toward Billy.
It is said that, one stormy night, the young child of the tribal chief was swept away by the river. His parents were devastated, praying desperately to the river's spirit to bring their child back. But all their pleas were in vain. The river spirit did not heed their cries, and the child was lost forever. But that's when the curse began.
She continued, her voice dropping to a murmur.
In her anguish, the child's mother committed a forbidden act. She performed an ancient ritual to summon her child's spirit back, binding it to the river. But because the child did not die a natural death, its soul became a wandering, one accursed entity, forever trapped between life and death. And so, the child's spirit has roamed for hundreds of years, unable to move on, unable to leave the river, always searching for another soul to replace it.
Jacob's heart clenched tightly.
Then that means...
Yes,
Agatha said, her gaze piercing through him.
The child's spirit wants your son to take its place, so that it can finally be free.
Jacob felt his breath hitch. His eyes blurred as he stared at his unmoving son lying on the couch.
No, I won't let that happen. I won't let him become a sacrifice for a vengeful spirit. Never.
Then what do you intend to do?
Agatha's lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile.
Do you think you can fight a being that has existed for over 200 years? Do you believe you can defeat an ancient spirit?
Is there another way?
Earl's voice cut in, weak but filled with hope.
Is there any way to break the curse without sacrificing the boy?
Agatha fell silent, her eyes narrowing as if deep in thought. Then she turned back to the book, flipping through the pages quickly, her thin fingers brushing over the strange text. After a moment, she stopped, her eyes gleaming.
There is a way,
She said slowly,
but it's dangerous. To break the curse, you must return the child's spirit to the place where it died and perform a ritual to release it back to the river. But if you make even a single mistake, the curse will grow stronger, and it will bind not just your son's soul, but yours as well.
I'll do it.
Jacob replied immediately, his voice resolute.
Even if it kills me, I won't let Billy be harmed.
Agatha studied him, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes.
Then listen carefully. Here is what you must do.
That night, Jacob and Earl returned to the Willow River, with Billy lying on a small stretcher that Earl had fashioned. They had prepared everything exactly as Agatha had instructed: white salt, black candles, and a sharp silver dagger. The night was pitch black, the sky devoid of any stars, and the river flowed silently, like a ribbon of darkness winding through the night.
We have to place the boy on that rock, right by the riverbank.
Earl whispered, pointing to a jagged outcrop that jutted out into the water.
That's where the spirit of the ancient child was swept away.
Jacob carefully lifted Billy and laid him down on the rock, where the murky waters flowed beneath. Earl quickly spread salt in a circle around Billy, lighting the black candles at the positions Agatha had specified.
What now?
Jacob asked, his voice trembling with anxiety.
We must call the child's spirit here.
Earl murmured, his hands shaking as he held the silver dagger.
You must recite the curse-breaking incantation Agatha gave us, and when the spirit appears, you must stab it with this dagger just as it tries to touch the boy. If you do it correctly, the curse will be broken.
Jacob swallowed hard, taking a deep breath. He stood beside Billy, his eyes fixed on the thick darkness surrounding them.
Cursed spirit, I summon you. Come here and face me.
He shouted, his voice echoing across the river. The air around them instantly turned frigid. The black candles flickered and snuffed out, plunging them into complete darkness. Then, from the center of the river, a small figure slowly emerged. The child, with its long, wet hair and hollow eyes, glided silently toward Billy. It said nothing, simply watching Jacob, its lips curling into a grotesque smile.
Play with me.
It whispered, its voice like a cold wind piercing through bone.
No, you won't touch my son.
Jacob roared, raising the silver dagger high. The ghost laughed, a high, chilling sound, and then, with a sudden lunge, it darted straight toward Billy. Jacob roared, throwing himself forward, his hand plunging the silver dagger down. The blade pierced through the black mist enveloping the child, A piercing scream shattered the night, and the spirit convulsed, its red eyes blazing with agony.
Numb.
It shrieked, then crumpled inward, dissolving into wisps of dark smoke. The river churned violently, small waves frothing white, and then everything fell still once more. Billy stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open.
Dad.
He whispered, his voice weak but alive. Jacob collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he wrapped his arms around his son.
My boy, you're back. You're back.
Earl staggered forward, a faint smile on his lips.
We did it. The curse has been broken.
They stood by the riverbank, watching the silent water flow past, knowing the nightmare was finally over. But deep in the night, somewhere in the dark depths of the river, a small shadow drifted aimlessly, its red eyes glowing faintly. The curse may have been broken, but the Willow River would never forget the souls